Hello, you are listening to the Significant Brothers podcast. I'm Brad.
I'm Kray.
I'm Chase.
And today we are talking about magic. Now imagine this. You're walking in the woods and your phone is dead. Out of the corner of your eye, you spot him.
Shia LaBeouf.
He's sneaking up behind you. No, but today we're talking about magic. And I kind of picked this topic because I needed to pick something and I wasn't sure this one popped into my mind. I really wish that we could have had more time on this, but I picked Scandinavian magic. But literally, you are in the woods. You're in your own little hut or whatever you're living up in the Scandinavian region, and there's a knock on your door. And who would you expect to be at your door in the middle of the night?
A woodsman?
Not a woodsman.
A hunter.
Not a hunter. Which are almost the same thing, guys. We need some creativity here. But no, it's a frail old woman asking for passage into your home. Some food.
Do this as a knock-knock joke?
Yeah. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
It's me. I need passage into your home.
Well, come on in.
Okay. Okay, so in my mind, and this is just kind of like my Western preconceived notion of who would be holding power in these situations. Obviously, you view magic users as people who hold a lot of power. They do if they can wield magic. That's a pretty powerful thing. In Scandinavian times, women were primarily the magic users. They didn't really have witches. The type of magic they used was shamanic. It was a lot of channeling of spirits, predicting the future, healing. I don't know, it was more, I guess, practical magic.
Like apothecary and...
Yeah, potions and...
holistic healing. We have a few of those.
Kind of two different kinds of magic. There was the Seidor and the Spa. And the Seidor was mostly all the non-prophecy kind of magic, and the Spa was everything else. But magic was mostly seen as a woman's activity. Sure, men could do it, but they were kind of like looked down upon if men practiced magic. There's even stories of Odin practicing Seidor, and then Loki was making fun of him because it's a woman's type thing. The woman I had spoke of earlier going from door to door, she would go to people and invite her, and they would feed her animal hearts because they were seemed to imbue wisdom upon whoever's eating them, and they would give a prophecy the next day of like, oh, your crops will be good, or I will end the droughts, or something like that. But yeah, around 900 to 1100 AD, Christianity was spreading at this point. Jesus died basically 1,000 years ago, and they're making their way up to these different regions. And of course, like, well, we can't have this, guys. Magic is bad. And even in their old literature, Christians would be rewriting or just writing on a historical perspective of the area that they're in. And, quote, they reduced the gods to devils, pagan worshippers to malevolent sorcerers, and those practicing magic, and in pagan context became regarded practitioners of the most perverse and evil deeds. Any culture that they did have, you can look back on your culture and it's like, oh yeah, we did these things. Like we worshipped these gods. They didn't really honor the culture that they used to have. They kind of just destroyed it. And nowadays we can look back and it's like, okay, this is what they used to do, and we can look at it through a neutral lens. Mm-hmm. But they just kind of...
So magic was like destroying the culture of the time? Or people using witchcraft?
No.
Christians destroyed their culture.
Christians destroyed their culture.
Oh, I see. Okay, so... Okay, the Christians came in and said nay to witchcraft?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that was kind of the right thing to do, but their culture and that part of their life and the Norse gods and all of that was just like, oh, this is really bad. We should make sure that people view this as it used to be a really bad thing that we did. And then the culture was forever changed.
Some people call them wizards. Some people call them warlocks. Some people call them scryers or witches. There have been a number of people who claim to be illusionists or magicians who know that they're not actually doing magic but are just playing a little bit of trickery on people. But there are a number of people who claim to be wizards, especially in the British Isles, who either existed, may have existed, definitely existed, but the question of whether they could actually do magic or not, I'll leave that up to you guys. There are two magicians that people are pretty sure existed. The name of one, his name was John Dee. He was the astrologer for Queen Elizabeth II, and he would give her guidance as far as what the stars say. He started off as like a mathematician, and so he pretty much got his start. He was at his university, and he was the stage manager, and people were impressed by his ability to make tricks happen on stage. Pretty much he was a stage manager, and then he became a magician after that because people saw that he could play a lot of trickery on people right before their very eyes. So he got onto Queen Elizabeth's court and was fed up with the lack of progress that can be made in politics. It frustrated him because he put a lot of his study in math and science and astrology, which doesn't go in with math and science, but it was one of those things that he studied, but he was frustrated that like his services weren't very much used, and towards the end of his life, actually, he felt a tear between him because he thought that science and magic went hand in hand, but that became more and more evident that they don't as time went by, so he had like a little bit of a crisis because he identified himself as a magician scientist, but there's nothing more different than those two topics. In fact, I would say they're two almost entirely exclusive lifestyles, being a magician and being a scientist.
I almost feel like the more you find about science, the less you can explain with magic. He was probably using magic to explain scientific things, but the more you learn about science, you're like, oh, this wasn't magic.
Here's the scientific evidence for how this works, and it's not magic.
Magic is what people turn to when they can't figure out how something happens. So John Dee's downfall was him thinking that he doesn't really need the whole science thing. I think that the worst thing that happened to John Dee was he met Edward Kelly, who was also a magician, who's told John Dee, you don't need politics, you don't need all of this sciencey stuff. I can talk to angels. Edward Kelly said, I can talk to angels. And he's like, John Dee, I think you should do it. And you should also be a scryer. And so they would look into crystal balls together and see stuff. And they traveled along the countryside of Europe because they thought that they could do magic. Edward Kelly said he could talk to angels. And one of the most interesting things that he heard, Kelly said to John Dee, the angel said that we should share everything in our lives, including your wife. So he said to John Dee, if the angels are true and you believe the angels, I should sleep with your wife. Which is where you already know that this Edward Kelly guy may be a little bit weird. And maybe he can't talk to angels and maybe he wanted something out of this. But John Dee said, I think we should stop talking to angels. However, I agree with you. You should sleep with my wife. I think Edward Kelly, people believe that he fathered one of John Dee's children with his wife. But they both were married, so they both swapped their wives.
So you could tell this was on their mind for a while. They really didn't even need an angel to tell them that. They were just kind of waiting. Like John Dee was about to bring it up, but then he's like, nah, I don't even care that you told me an angel told you. Let's just do it.
John Dee, for the longest time, was a very promising person who was going to study at Cambridge and was going to be an academic. And I believe he got thrown in jail before for witchcraft of that time, which was calculating the Queen's horoscope. And they threw him in jail for it, and then they threw him in jail for also guessing the coronation of the next queen correctly. I don't know how the queen died, but I assume maybe assassination, and he guessed that one correctly. Edward Kelly had promised a king at the time that he could make gold by just doing like alchemy stuff. These guys were into a lot of different type of magic. He said that he could make like pretty much nothing into gold, and he couldn't, and he got thrown in jail, and he begged for a second chance. They let him out. He still couldn't do it, so they threw him back in jail, and he was trying to escape, and he had escape attempts. And then eventually one of his escapes, he fell off the wall and died.
And he turned into gold.
And an angel did not break his fall, I'm guessing.
I think it was because he lied about the whole sleeping with the other guy's wife. They were just like, we didn't say that.
Yeah. Back in the ancient times, magic was characterized by all-powerful gods in parallel universes to humans, kind of like Mount Olympus. They had backstories, and they were the sole arbiters of magic and power, and usually things didn't end well for humans in those stories. Magic was generally seen as not beneficial to humans at all. As times went on, magic came from these supernatural creatures, kind of like nymphs or fairies, and they ended up helping our human protagonists, and not only did they help the humans, but the humans were kind of like the central part of the story. It was much more focused on earthly world rather than other supernatural worlds. In Greek mythology, we'll take the Odyssey, for instance. Or in the Odyssey, it starts with Odysseus like 2 years after the Trojan War or something. He's trying to get back home. So it is almost human-centric that the fact that we're following Odysseus through this entire adventure, but a lot of bad things happen to him because all-powerful gods just decide that they should happen to him, or just be... magic never ends up being a good thing for him. He's trapped on an island by a nymph named Calypso. He has his men turned into swine by the goddess of magic, tempted while sailing by magical sirens. And ultimately his fate is even debated on Mount Olympus because they're all deciding what should his future be. It's not really up to the control of Odysseus, even though he's like totally awesome.
So magic is kind of allowed by the gods to happen by humans.
I believe the magic comes from the gods. Is that correct?
Yeah, it comes from the gods, and I guess if the gods so chose, humans can be affected by it. And usually, it doesn't turn out well for them. For Odysseus, it ultimately turns out well, but he has to go through a lot of magical crap in order to get to his final resolution. It's a big thanks to Athena, who's like his biggest proponent, I think, among the gods.
In this world of the Odyssey, is magic the ultimate trump card, or can it be fought with hand-to-hand combat like Dungeons and
I
Dragons?
think there's usually an instance where man overcomes God, but where gods always overcome men, or somehow they leave their realm to sort of mess with the humans or something, and it ends up in a blissful tale for them, but it's usually always bad for the humans. It's kind of like God-centric and like more centric around this other parallel world, whereas the earthly world's just kind of like, oh crap, here come the gods, they're just gonna screw with us again. Now we move into medieval Christian Europe, maybe around 14th century, so this is many years later. So obviously the fairy tale is getting transformed in some way, and it's kind of becoming transformed towards our modern fairy tale, but sort of with a Christian world. The modern fairy tale would have our hero and some sort of magical helper who doesn't really have a background story, who doesn't come from a parallel universe, and it's centered around humans. And ultimately, magic makes the ending happy, whereas ancient fairy tales, the magic doesn't make things happy, it makes things bad. So there's a story by Johannes Gobi, he's a Dominican monk, and it's the story of a father dying and he needs water from the fountain of life. And whoever gets him that water gets the kingdom. So the first son searches the riverbanks, doesn't find anything. The second son searches the plains, and then the third son searches the mountain, where he finds this old man who tells them how to go about these 4 trials. So he ends up defeating a snake and resisting a bunch of women for the pleasures of the flesh, and a bunch of other just kind of strange trials. But he ultimately gets through trials successfully, and he finds this woman who has a key to the fountain of life. So he gets the water, he gets the woman, and he gets the kingdom. So
sign me up.
Yeah, exactly. But normally, what we would expect is that somehow amidst all these trials, it would be taxing on our hero. It would be somewhat difficult for our hero, and just because of his inner goodness, a magic helper would come out and help him, and it would make everything happy. But it almost has these elements, but instead of a magic helper, even though he has to face these magical elements, it's because of his religious purity that ends up saving him.
Is the reason that magic was used in these tales is to, I guess, draw a relatable parallel for people who are of the Christian faith? So it's using them as a metaphor?
So this is one of those stories that's meant to it's like a fairy tale meant to teach a lesson, which I thought was interesting because usually in Christianity, you don't play around with nymphs with some magical power or something. The 16th century, kind of like near the Italian Renaissance, is more of an evolution, and Straparella's like Pleasant Nights. I don't have specific examples from the tales because there's just a bunch of them. But it was written in the 16th century, and it helped define our modern fairy tales with magically resolved endings, and with it's human-centric. It's animals and supernaturals helping our heroes just because of their inner goodness. Right, and eventually belief in magic kind of became irrelevant with the Enlightenment and questioning all established knowledge and stuff. So that has to do with it too.
So why do you think magic has become popular in current culture? Do you think now we have an unprecedented love of magic than what we used to, say, over 100 years ago?
Fantasy really hit its stride with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I want to know, like, why before? Was it because of, like, religious orthodoxy? Or, I don't know, I feel like we just really love the fantastical, and we long for this, like, imagined past of, like, knights and fairy tales.
I think the low point for magic was the newly founded Protestantism, which condemned witchcraft, and so put a lot of people to death. And I think it's so far removed from religion now. Back in the day, that idea of those being hand in hand, which, you know, a lot of the traditions of the church influenced the way that people view magic.
It's almost like we have a really good understanding of how things work nowadays. There's not a lot of stuff that we can't explain any reason for magic. It's pretty much just completely fiction. And so because magic isn't in any part of our lives real at all, that we can start playing with magic in terms of adding it to fiction and adding it back into our lives in another non-real way.
Yeah, because I think if you hear about someone and they invite you over Wednesday night and they say, we're gonna light a bunch of candles, sit around in a circle and chant things to Satan or something, or cast spells, you'd be pretty freaked out. I would be. I'd be like, well, I don't know how I feel about that. But if someone's, writing a story about magic, it's almost like we still have this overspill effect from maybe Protestants condemning magic. Because just think, a few years back, 10 years back, I don't know, Harry Potter came out. A lot of traditional people still have problems with Harry Potter.
Yeah, no, I think the idea of magic being real is unsettling for a lot of us, and I think what's even more unsettling is people thinking that it's real. The people who do, like, the exorcisms and...
Well, it's like, where, if any magic that we use or people try to use today, it's basically left for speaking with the dead. There's no one, like, trying to bring people back from the dead through magic, because we know that once the body's gone, it's basically gone. There's no one trying to change the weather or whatever like that, really. But there's almost like nothing that's saying that we can't communicate with the dead. The afterlife is something that science can't touch at all. Nothing that we can confirm nor deny. So it's like seances and things like that are kind of like the only thing that's around a little bit.
That's kind of true. That's like the only thing that's like left that you could kind of argue.
It's the biggest supernatural superstition that we have left.
Science has yet to debunk that.
They have debunked fireballs and controlling lightning. Talking to the dead used to be seen as like a fun thing to do. Like
that doesn't sound fun at all.
I think it sounds like a great date idea.
No, I mean, well, what else are you going to do after you go to the burning of the witches at the stake?
No, this should be on a list of like 20 great date ideas that don't exist anymore.